At the beginning of the 20th century, Sibelius was persuaded somewhat reluctantly by his friends and family that he would be better off living and working in the countryside rather than in the bright lights of Helsinki. So in 1903, he and his family bought a plot of land here near what was then the very small village of Järvenpää, and they had a house built to a design by the eminent architect Lars Sonck. The house was ready and they could move in September of 1904, and they called the house Ainola, after Sibelius' wife Aino. With a few exceptions, trips abroad, a few brief periods in the city of Helsinki, Sibelius lived here for the rest of his life. He was in his mid-30s when he moved here, and he lived here for 53 years. It was here that he wrote 5 out of his 7 symphonies, that he revised the violin concerto, that he composed tone poems such as Pohjola's Daughter and the Oceanides. And nowadays, this rather splendid house is a museum which welcomes something like 6,000 visitors a month. I'm joined here today by the conductor Jukka-Pekka Saraste. Jukka-Pekka, when you come to Ainola and when you're surrounded by Sibelius's artifacts, his piano, his trophies, his portraits, his possessions, does it make you feel closer to him as a person?
Yeah, of course. As a Finn, you start thinking of the period of history when he lived here and what the life was like. And of course, this is a very modest way of living that he led here.
Especially when he moved in with very few modern conveniences.
Yeah, and also the kind of why he came here. It's a situation that was not desired because of the landowners thought that his reputation or his friends are too close. If we move closer to the lake, that can be seen from here. But actually, he was seen as a very bohemian artist with too many friends, having too good times, and of course he and the wife, of course, Aino, wanted to create space for him that he could better concentrate to what he was supposed to do. I keep thinking, was he truly Finnish composer, or how big part of this identity he had was that he felt like being part of Europe, part of the world. And to me, it's clearly remarkable at the end of his years, because he kind of lost the physical contact to European concert life. He didn't travel anymore. And my private explanation why he stopped composing was that he kind of became almost too isolated.
When Sibelius was working on the Fifth Symphony, like so many of his works, he was influenced by his friend and confidant Axel Karpelan, who sadly died 6 months before the final version of the Fifth Symphony was ready. Would you say that in some way the final Fifth Symphony is a requiem for Karpelan?
It's a requiem for some kind of soul, and when after the Misterioso, that in the first version takes long time, the very static, non-happening thing when it bursts to this, the only lament melody in the whole symphony, which is a long, it's like a song. There you, for the first time, can hear the passion of something that has been only hinted before. And sometimes I'm surprised that where does this come from? Because there were only some chromatic, passionate items earlier on in the symphony. And now you hear like a big lament, a big melody that combines almost everything that you have heard before. So in that moment, I think he truly comes close to something like death and maybe religion. Or
Sibelius's Fifth Symphony, in its original form, had 4 movements, whereas in the familiar published version that came 4 years later, it had only 3. Now, the original 1915 version was produced in time for Sibelius to play at his 50th birthday concert in December 1915. Do you think that maybe he had to hurry along to be ready with the music in time?
very much so, but that is usually the case with all composing. I have noticed that very few composers actually manage their deadlines, and so the last forcing a piece to come through is more or less hasty with so many composers.
Does that mean, though, that the original 4-movement 1915 Fifth is not a viable work in its own right?
I think for me it was a sensation to hear and do it for the first time, and when I heard it for the first time, I didn't respect it as much as after second or third hearing, because in my opinion he tried to create a totally different piece.
When the Fifth Symphony was first heard in December 1915, it had, of course, 4 movements rather than 3 that we know from the definitive version. And Sibelius also revised the whole symphony not once but twice over the next 4 years. Why do you think he kept on returning to it?
Well, actually, he was, I quote what he tried to say, he has from God or from somebody received this mosaic, and God wants him to put these pieces together, but he doesn't quite know how. And so when the big success after the first performance, that was his 50th birthday concert, some composers after such a success would, of course, say that, okay, fine, this was a great performance, great work. He kind of felt the need to come back, and unfortunately that doesn't happen very often with the composers.
Indeed. Sibelius was, as we know, a very self-critical artist, and he revised many of his famous works, not only the Fifth Symphony, but also, for instance, the tone poem Ensaga, the Lemminkainen Suite, the Violin Concerto, the Oceanides, the Cantata Tulen Suntu, and many, many more. When he revised the Fifth Symphony, he combined the original 4 movements into 3, and in doing so, what were originally the first 2 movements were fused into 1. Did he just somehow stick them together, or were the motifs already so closely related that it was an automatic decision?
I believe the latter, because I think the material is really very close, and he kind of realized that this has to be glued together, and the way he did it was quite sensational.
Absolutely. Normally, in the process of revision, he would make the works more compact.
Yeah.
In the slow movement of the Fifth Symphony, on the other hand, the original version is shorter than the final. Did he then introduce any radical new material into the slow movement?
Yeah, it's kind of this outbursts of brass and the grand stops. I think for dramatic purposes he needed something to happen in order to because I think that this slow movement is only like an introduction to the finale. I think this is the hardest thing to do, after all, with non-Finnish orchestras, is to get the atmosphere of the slow movement, the andante. Because if you haven't been in Finland in summertime and heard something very naive, like singing, the naivety of the third movement or second movement, the andante, is something very rare in music, in classical music. And where you put the pizzicato and the flute, and then some harmonic process underneath or above.
Rare in music, yes, but maybe not rare in Sibelius's symphonies. I would also be reminded at this point of the slow movement of the Third Symphony.
The melody of the Third Symphony is like that's more passionate, and of course a little bit more kind of this Eastern influenced Finnish music, Karelian, almost like a lament as well. But this is like a summer song from some kind of easy happiness, which is not very often related to Finnish music, because Finnish music is supposed to be serious and tough. And so in Paris, for instance, when I did this pizzicato theme, and then comes the O Sole Mio theme, they all sang.
The finale of the Fifth Symphony, in its 1915 version, is considerably longer and more diffuse than in the published 1919 score. And it contains actually two moments of remarkable dissonance.
Yeah.
A masterstroke of imagination or a terrible miscalculation.
I think what's the most daring thing to put into this, I think that clearly connects this work to the Fourth Symphony because of the dissonance. And when I conducted this with the Oslo Philharmonic, when this came and they had to play it, they looked at each other and almost couldn't do it because there was this E flat chord and then they have to put this F flat on top of it in the very high register. That's a moment that somebody that lives in the harmony wouldn't do. And
But it sounds fantastic.
It's fantastic, and I miss that. That is the only real thing that I miss in the third version. That somehow this is Sibelius. That's the tension, and this is the war inside him.
Det är lite annorlunda. Lite annorlunda och sen är konstigt att det här temat kommer från första satsen och plötsligt det blir liksom det här Lego eller Jigsaw var i hans minne och sen plötsligt allt ändrades. Och nu får vi höra alla teman som finns i stycket. Largamente. 4 och
The ending of the symphony in the familiar 1919 version is one of its most famous moments, with these widely spaced, although actually very precisely notated chords. And this was also very different in the first version, wasn't it?
Yeah, the first version ending, of course, it was very traditional, almost like Wagner orchestration, where the chords came obviously conclusive chords, and in this last version, it's like a feeling of eternity when the melody has gone, and only the shape of the character of the pulse or the chords keep it going. So in a way, after hearing those chords, your mind is still continuing the symphony to eternity.